The following is a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio. Keep your mission on your mind and your mind on your mission. This is Mission Minded with Michael Coleman.
Oh, I'm so happy because Michael Coleman's a good friend of mine. I love doing good radio with good friends. Michael, how you doing, brother? Everything good?
Yeah, today's a great day. Excited to be here. Always enjoy getting to take a little time to spend with you, my friend.
Absolutely. So Michael and I go back a few years, and he used to be with the Jimmy Hale Mission, and we became good friends, and we've broken some bread together, and we've read some Bible scripture together, and that's good. And of course, he's now with the Montgomery Area Food Bank, covering 35 counties in the great state of Alabama, mafb.org, and I know you're going to have some changes coming up, perhaps, on that, so we'll have some details on that coming up as well. But we talked about some business. We talked about non-for-profits, and I talked about the tree, right? We got our roots, and we started talking about non-for-profits, and of course it branches out, and then we're talking about businesses, and we're talking about all kinds of things. This week I want to get into some strikes, but before we do that, we always take some emails, info@TonyCurryRadio.net, info@TonyCurryRadio.net. Tom in Hueytown said he saw an interesting story called A History Fast Forward on the Budweiser brand. That aired a couple of nights ago, and I'm going to paraphrase because it's kind of long, but he basically saw this Budweiser thing. They were talking about the Budweiser frogs, and evidently that was one of the best and biggest branding features of any brand, period, when it hit, but sales were flat. He also mentions the fact the Got Milk campaign, which people still use, was huge for the milk and the dairy industry, but their numbers were flat. He said, what does it mean when you create a great brand for something, but your numbers don't go up? Is it a good or a bad thing?
Well, it's a mix. I mean, the bottom line is it's all about the sales.
There you go.
Because that's where your money is. And, so it all depends on how you define success. And so when you go into a marketing campaign, and I'll give you an example, we're fixing to go through a name change.
Yes.
And so the idea is, okay, what is success when you're trying to market the name change of the Montgomery Food Bank? So part of it is we want people to recognize that the Montgomery Food Bank and changing into a new name, we're the same one. We're not a different food bank who's coming into the area in competition with Montgomery Food Bank. So if we're able to communicate that effectively, then maybe that's a win. Our dollars may not be greater, but it all depends on what your intention is. And I would think with Budweiser, anytime, because it's already an established brand, and I remember that commercial, man, when that first came out, that was great. And I remember some of the best Budweiser commercials. You remember the dog and the horses and around the Super Bowl time? Oh, they were just tear jerkers. I mean, but the frogs doing the Bud was, it was just a classic. And, but if you were to go back and say, wow, that was an iconic commercial and something that people have remembered forever. If you were to go back and talk to their marketing people, well, if it didn't produce sales, was it ultimately successful? I think if people are talking about it in a positive way, because you have to think about it. If the idea is you want to put your brand out there and then have people out there talking about your brand. And so from that perspective, yes. But if the beer is not good, and I'm not particularly a beer drinker, so
I don't think that's the issue because, obviously we know that Budweiser has been around forever and it's Bud Light. But let me ask you this, and they also talked about the what's up, thing, which I think is hilarious. I've got back on that. My daughter thinks I'm incredibly annoying when I keep doing that because it's hard to stop saying with that when you start saying with that. But for example, Spud McKenzie, that they saw their markets go up 20% when that happened. It was one of their biggest marketing ploys. And I think a lot of times just humor really works when you're talking about branding. But how frustrating is it when, and I'm going to use the Got Milk one because how does that not work? You're saying Got Milk, so it's a milk it's a milk brand thing, right? Like if I said got steak and I'm talking about milk, I understand the disconnect, but how frustrating it is when everyone's talking about your product, but your sales aren't going up. What does that tell you as a business owner, particularly if you've got something like milk or Budweiser that's already on our dinner tables every night?
Well, let's say, for instance, if you have a product X, and nobody knows about the product, and you introduce it, and everybody's talking about it, and everybody goes and tries the product that otherwise wouldn't have tried. They like it. They tell their friends about it. Oh, this has a great taste, and I'm going to start drinking more. Think about milk, for example. People pretty much, my only milk I drink is in my cereal. And so people, for the most part, already know whether they like milk or not. So they might like the commercial, but people aren't going to start drinking it because of the commercial, you wouldn't think. I mean, they either like milk and they're buying it already, or they don't like milk and they're not. And so I'm not necessarily shocked that the milk didn't go up, but, the whole thing is, advertising is about getting more people to try your brand. And if people feel like they already know what that is, then they might like the commercial. It may get favorable ratings. It may create a lot of buzz. It's not going to necessarily result in more users of your product.
It's really interesting. Michael Coleman joins us here. By the way, this is Mission Minded. I don't think I've even mentioned that. A mission in your mind in your mission here. You can hear the show at least 5 days a week here on TKR right around 9 o'clock every single morning. And of course, wherever you get your podcast, Tony Curre Radio Podcast. And now, super easy, TKR on both Android and Apple. You're good to go. Just put TKR in. You'll see the guitar. Listen to us. We got great shows here on the radio station, our podcast series. Because when you're talking about, say, milk, or I'll even use the beef industry, if you're a vegetarian, you're not eating beef. So I don't know if you're going out there. And if you eat meat and you're already eating meat, I don't know if you're watching a beef commercial, if that's going to make you eat more meat. Milk is interesting, right? Because if you would look at the demographics at the time you did that advertising, you may have seen a lot of, say, adolescent or preteens being out of the milk. I mean, because I think milk obviously is obviously predominantly younger. I'm 57. I still love glasses of milk, but I know a lot of people my age don't drink milk anymore. So I think that's interesting. But when you're talking about Budweiser, I would just think it would be from a branding situation. I mean, obviously, I'd want to look at Miller Lite to see how I'm affecting their sales, and they were flat during that period of time. Where are the beer and then I guess maybe you look at other beer companies. Was something else introduced at the same time that you had this particular campaign? So I guess what I'm saying is I'd rather have the branding than nothing, but that's got to be frustrating as a business owner to have great branding and people talking about your product but not using it.
Well, you have a ubiquitous product like milk, and you're like, okay, pretty much whether you like milk or not. So if I'm going to come in, it's not just a catchphrase or something. I'm like, I've got to give people a reason to rethink about milk. So I may emphasize, like they've done in other spots, where they go and they talk about the importance of vitamin D and the bone structure and all that. And as you get older in life, a reason for people to connect what they're hearing with their health or with and that's always the thing, is you're trying different approaches to see what hits in somebody's mind. Because just like you said, 2 great commercials, one drives up sales, one does nothing. And it runs people mad because you're digging into the data and trying to get an understanding of the whys behind it. And I would tell you, in the nonprofit world, it's very challenging, because we're doing so many different things. We're approaching food insecurity from so many different avenues. And we're always like, we don't always want to put the sad child who's hungry. I don't like that negative advertising. I like, here's something positive. Here's a child who's getting to eat because of you, and they're happy and they're joyful, and they have an optimism about themselves. And but the reality is some things work with some people and some things, and so don't. And so, unfortunately, it's a lot of trial and error in the advertising game.
Yeah, and sometimes during slow times of the year when it comes to advertising, we certainly see that around summertime. I'll see a lot of ASPCA commercials. I see, and I know they probably have agreements, and I think it's St. Jude's Research Hospital is one of the most amazing places on the face of the earth. But to watch their 3-minute commercials, if I have to see them over and over and over again, it does. It starts to bum me out. But they are very effective, and we know that in the marketing business, normally someone's got to see or hear something 17 times before they pull the trigger on it. So
I would tell you about the St. Jude thing. Now, here's what's very smart about what they do. And I saw this recently on a LinkedIn post. I actually even shared it, I think. It says marketing is not about making the sale in the moment, because lots of times your customers are not ready to buy.
Yep. Marketing
is about giving them the information and the incentive that when they are ready to buy, you're in their mind. And so St. Jude, it's heart-wrenching. But what it does leave behind is this idea that, look, kids with no money who need serious cancer treatment, that's what that hospital is. So then later on, when they send me something 4 or 5 months, and I used to get these little packets, and they're really pretty masterful at this, but they would send a whole thing of return address labels to my home. And you would almost feel like, man, I'd at least give them something for putting these together for me. And so you send them, $25, $50 or something like that. And now they've got you. You're part of their donor base. And now they bring you into that cycle. And I'm not saying it's either wrong with it, maybe that's just how it works. And so they know exactly what they're doing. But lots of times it's not about making the sale in the moment. It's about preparing their minds. So I may be a beer drinker, going back to the Budweiser, even though those particular moves didn't move the needle a lot, those particular advertisements. The hope is that, hey, if you're not a beer drinker or you're not a Budweiser beer drinker, that, hey, we're the kind of people you want to be associated with. So give us a try. Maybe you like it. Maybe you like it better than what you're doing. Just for whatever reason, it didn't produce the particular results they wanted.
The sticky labels, I know a lot of people don't do the snail mail anymore, very effective because we call that the residual effect, because if you're writing letters or sending in bills and using those stickies every time you put one on your return label, you're thinking about St. Jude's Research Hospital.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Pretty stinking brilliant is what it is. He's Michael Coleman. He is the CEO of the Montgomery Area Food Bank, MAFB.org for now. Not your job, but MAFB.org for now. We'll have some details on that coming up, some exciting news coming up, as well as a brand new show about the Montgomery Food Bank coming up here in the next few weeks as well. Want to get into strikes. We had Starbucks trying to unionize. We had Amazon trying to unionize, and some of those did, some of those did not. There's been votes on that. We had the railroad unions workers trying to strike it went all the way to Washington, D.C. Now, we have the Screenwriters Guild, or if you will, going on strike. And now the Screen Actors Guild of the American Federation of TV and Television and Radio, they are going on strike. And so you're seeing Sudeikis and all these guys, walking in the picket lines there in Hollywood. And of course, that means we're probably going to be streaming a lot of old movies here in the next few months. And now I'm seeing where the UPS workers want better pay and better conditions. And UPS, the company itself, is saying that they're going to start training up to 340,000 non-union workers to take those positions. As a person who obviously likes to buy and have things shipped to my house, I'm glad, because I don't want to see my service interrupted. And we are just about 4 or 5 months away from Christmas, believe it or not. But what's your overall thoughts on these strikes? And we're not talking about small companies. We're talking about monster companies that are going to be directly affecting the way we watch television, the way we get our packages.
Well, I will say this: if UPS is fixing to take on the task of hiring 350 or training 350,000 non-union workers to deliver packages, I want to get all my Christmas shopping done in October because it could be a potential nightmare. Yeah. Now, I will tell you, way back, I took when I was in the military, but I was doing my college classes on the evenings and weekends, and I took a business law course, and we had a whole thing in there about strikes, going back to why it was so important. And if you most of our audience couldn't imagine the working conditions that people were subjected to. It was so dangerous, the working conditions. And the workers just had no voice whatsoever. And I mean, people were literally losing their lives. And it was like, no big deal, next person who needs a job. And so unionization made all the sense in the world to step forward and to say, listen, you just can't victimize people. But people were so desperate for work, they would be willing to take those kind of risks. And so we got a really chance to study it. And I actually got into some union negotiations and really fascinating stuff, and trying to see it both from the business perspective and the employee's perspective. Today, I still understand where people want the best possible outcomes for their jobs, and I don't begrudge them the idea of wanting to make as much as they can. But the conditions, and I think this is why union membership is at an all-time low, is because you have agencies such as OSHA who make sure that you can't have unsafe working conditions, and there's the court systems where workers can reach out, and equal opportunity office, all those kind of things. There's all these protections in government that make it where unionization is not as vital. But having said all that, a union can be very effective depending on what the issues are. But most of the time, it just simply boils down to money and benefits. And it really sometimes puts a real, like, if Hollywood goes out, no big deal. That's a minor convenience, not producing new shows. But when you get into things such as packages and things like that, I think the workers understand they have a little bit more leverage because there's going to be a little bit more angst.
What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on, and railroads obviously have a huge impact on us because of the supply chain, but what's your thoughts on, and I know you got to be careful here, but what's your thoughts on teachers striking? When it comes to human resources, firefighters, police officers, or teachers, they have taken that job for a reason. And I God bless them, because it's a job I don't want, or even the military. There's a lot of people that don't want to be teachers because it is underpaid. They don't want to be firefighters. They don't want to be police officers. And thank God we have people that do those jobs. But when necessary resources strike, what's your thoughts on that and how that affects our communities?
Well, I'll be honest up front. My wife's a teacher. Both my daughters are teachers, one at a college level and one at an elementary level with my daughters. And so I see what the expectations are in the classroom, and with each passing year, they seem to get more and more ridiculous in terms of lack of parental help and discipline at home and structure at home. And so the teachers, basically the kids come to school, the teachers have no recourse basically to discipline them. And it is oftentimes chaotic. And we're talking about in Alabama, where in some schools, you still can get paddled. Yeah. I mean, but some of the other
Amen,
schools,
brother. Amen.
Well,
we did.
I tell you what, I was a pure hellion in school and got paddled a regular. If I didn't have to worry about getting paddled, I mean, it would be. Did your paddle have holes in it so it get a little faster? I'm gonna tell you something. Jimmy Lawrence was my principal, and he was an old University of Alabama lineman. And the worst paddling I got was a baseball bat that had been cut in half. Yeah. And had 3 major holes in it. Ouch. And right before Christmas, I know I'm telling old stories now, right before Christmas, I got on his shoulders and went running down the hallway. Right before the bell was just banging on all the teachers' doors. And he said, all right, you get 3 licks or 3 days suspension. And I was not about to go home and tell my dad I got suspended for 3 days for goofing off. Yeah. So I took those 3 licks, and brother, I tell you what, I never did that again. I'll tell you that. Funny. That's hilarious. Yeah. But no, the teachers, because I think, I think the teachers sometimes, and you could take it out of the teachers, you could do anything. At some point, there's a breaking point to where you feel like that there's not going to be any movement on the city. There's not necessarily about benefits. It could be about working conditions, and to say, look, if you want me to take without much assistance and try to educate a bunch of kids, rambunctious in this environment is so stressful, so this, lots of times you don't have an aide in class. Look, you're going to have to pay me more than somebody who is just kind of off the street, almost like an entry-level position in some places. You're just going to have to pay me more because I'm a professional. I have to go to school for 4 years. I have families to take, all that kind of stuff. So you kind of understand it from, at some point, it's the only leverage that a group of people have.
Yeah.
And if everything else has been tried and they can't do it, then what choice do they have? The flip side of that is, of course, you think back to the days of Ronald Reagan and the air traffic controllers, because they thought they had leverage and they were going to shut down the whole thing.
Yep.
And he just said, everybody's fired, you can't come back. And they just kind of started over. And that was one of the ramifications from it. So I understand it from a human perspective. At some point you get to your breaking point and you're like, we have to threaten to walk away to change the conditions. The conditions are so bad. But I'm not sure that's the situation with a lot. I'm less sympathetic when it looks like it's just over another $1 an hour or another benefit that you would jam up, such as UPS or the transportation system through the railroads.
Can you talk a little bit about, and I know that you were in the military, so you were part of it's a different kind of union, obviously, but you were with a large number of individuals. My brother worked for General Electric for over 20 years. They went on strike. He had seniority, although he wasn't really high up the ranks inside General Electric. He used to replace jet engines and stuff on airplanes. And what ended up happening is they end up winning, and the guys got so much raises, so much more vacation time. They end up laying off like 15,000 people at General. They're like, okay, fine. You're going to get what you want, but we're not going to be able to employ as many people. Can you talk about how strikes sometimes can backfire?
Yeah.
And I don't have any doubt that UPS is putting this out, that they're going to hire 340,000. I got a friend of mine who's making $37.50 an hour driving a UPS van. God love him. And getting paid gas money. And he's calling me up going, Tony, I can't lose my job. I'm making great money. I cannot afford. And he's low on the totem pole. So he's kind of like, he's part of the union. He pays his union dues, and he doesn't want to be a scab guy, but he's kind of like, this is kind of ridiculous because I'm kind of happy with my gig. What do you do then?
Well, my wife just asked me the other day, because we were looking at downtown Detroit, and she was like, okay, so Ford was there, GM was there. And I'm like, yeah. And at the time, they ruled the roost. They were able to keep foreign competitors out for the most part. I said, but now look at Alabama. Alabama's kind of the car capital. I mean, we have the new Toyota Mazda plant in Huntsville. We have Mercedes here. We have Honda here. And then we have Hyundai's headquarters here. And so we have, and then Kia, who is owned by Hyundai, is literally just across the Alabama-Georgia line over in Georgia. So a lot of the plants still serve there. And so why are all the car companies and the foreign companies that come in, because you've got BMW, South Carolina, just own and own and own, but they're all in the South. And it's because of non-unionized labor. Now, you could say that that's not fair. But if you look at it from the perspective of the car company, they're like, okay, non-unionized labor is going to be labor is obviously your biggest cost. And they're going to come in and they're not going to have the same kind of power structure, the same kind of problems, because that it was up north. And so the result of all that time of being on strike and making it hard on the auto manufacturers, again, not to say that individual strikes by GM and Ford were right or wrong or indifferent. I'm just saying the result was you play hardball, you play hardball, and then the owners or the board of directors or the CEO probably just says, hey, we're going to pick up our ball and go home. Yeah. We're going to go do business in a more business-friendly environment. And then those companies are left with, those cities are like, wait a minute, here's all our union wage jobs going away. And they're like, yep, that's the consequence of constant threats of strike, constant striking. And they just moved to more, and let's be honest, more tax friendly as well. And if you're a business owner and people want to get on that, and you're like, well, wait a minute, all of our retirements, all our 401ks, they're in these kind of stocks. Do we want them to make a profit? Of course we do, because that helps our retirement. So when people try to make companies, big, they always say it's big business, the boogeyman.
Yeah. We're
like, the average person has their retirement money invested in these companies. And so we want these companies to do well.
So if, and I know some people say I'm a union man, I'm not a union. I've never been part of a union. As a matter of fact, about 25 years ago, someone came up to me in the radio industry and said, we're starting a radio union. And I said, what? I said, why? And they're like, well, we need to get better pay, and we need more. And of course, if you're in radio, you love radio. You don't do it for the pay. You just don't. I mean, that's why there's people. I know guys that have been working for 35 years and they're making $35,000 a year. They just love doing radio because you can be kind of lazy, you can be creative. Normally, a person who's been in radio for over 30 years has a wife or a husband that's got a really good job. We're just living a hobby for the rest of our lives. So I was like, no, that's not going to happen. But would you be a scab? Do you have a problem? Or would you have to look at what the union's asking for before you'd cross a picket line to take someone's job? I'm asking you personally.
Yeah, just personally. I would definitely have to look, and the only way I think that I would do it is if my kids and my family were hungry. Yeah. And I was like, no, there's no other choice. I have to do it. I wouldn't be proud of it. Because look, whether you agree or necessarily disagree, I get the whole point is they're fighting for their families as well. And it wouldn't feel right for me to come behind them. But I'm not saying I wouldn't do it. If we do a lot of things, if this circumstances were extreme enough.
Real final question here before we go. Is the threat of unionization a smart thing on either side? And I guess what I'm saying is obviously you don't want to have to deal with a union if you're an owner of a business. But I mean, I can see where the threat would work, and you're like, oh, maybe I need to come off a couple of things, or maybe it's the oil, and I don't know what. I'm trying to think of an industry where you're making so much money it doesn't even matter, but yet you got guys on oil rigs, living out there 8-9 months a year. I don't know what kind of money the oil companies are making, but once you know that they're wanting to unionize, then how would you shut that down to make sure it never happens, or can you?
Well, you could you could look at the Amazon right here in Alabama in Birmingham. They built this huge center over there in Bessemer, and they had a couple of different rounds of voting to unionize, or allowing a vote to unionize, because federal law allows that. If you get enough signatures, they have to allow that vote. And so it was in the news for a long, long time. And then what begins to happen is they say, okay, if we see you're starting to unionize, well, we're just going to plan to move business around. I mean, that's the threat they always have is, oh, well, you know what, we were going to expand here, but if you're going to unionize, forget any future expansion. Yeah. We'll expand in another state. And so that may not matter to the individual who has the job, but the city officials, county commission, all that kind of stuff who depend on that revenue coming into their county, it matters to them.
Yeah. He's Michael Coleman, Montgomery Food Bank. Tell people how they can find you, Michael.
Yeah, find me on LinkedIn, reach out on MAFB, and always encourage people to go out and support their own food bank in their communities to help people feed those who are in need.
This has been a special presentation of Tony Curry Radio.